Well, in this message, I'd like to introduce you to 4 people who have had a powerful impact on your life and mine. 4 people from the past, 4 thinkers in our lives. But before I do that, I want to remind you of the 4 fundamental principles that I ask whenever I look at any kind of ideology or faith system or worldview. And they are these questions. I asked you these questions in our last message. That is, what is your truth source? Who is God? Who am I? And who is Jesus? What is our truth source? Who is God? Who am I? And who is Jesus? Now, just hold those for just a moment. Because I've been saying that I believe that the greatest threat, existential threat to our lives and our faith and our culture and our future these days is the rise of modern day socialism or neo-Marxism. And I've been saying that ideas have consequences. Ideas shape history, they shape events, they shape your life, and they shape my life. And as I introduce these 4 people to you, I want you to remember that ideas have consequences to them. Now, we're going to have to stretch our minds as we look at these 4 people. Whenever I give a message like this, I often have a response, and people just say flat out, wow, I'm exhausted. That was heavy. That was hard work. And it is. But I also have people say that but by the time we put the whole thing together, it makes sense. I have a framework in which to understand and evaluate and view every ideology or every world and faith system that exists today. So the mind is like a muscle. It's got to be exercised for it to get to be strong, and we're going to use that muscle today. Remember, Paul made a beeline when he got to Athens, to Mars Hill, to talk to the Greek philosophers of the day about their ideas and how those ideas were having consequences on people and on their lives. And we've been saying that we've been looking at the concept of monism. Monism is the understanding of the search and the quest for a unifying principle by which to explain all of life. It's the concept of the universals and the particulars. The way I look at it, it's like this. In our life, the Greek philosopher said, we see all these particulars. We see trees and houses and rocks and stars and moon and sun and sky and people. So all these little particulars, all these things. Is there a unifying principle that explains all of that and pulls all of it together? That's what a monist is. They're looking for a unifying principle. And I shared with you the first Greek philosophers in 500 BC who were asking this question were 2 men by the name of Parmenides and Heraclitus. Now Mr. Parmenides, he said, I've got the unifying principle. The unifying principle is this, that whatever is. That is, that things don't change, they stay the same. What is. And Mr. Heraclitus said, well, Mr. Parmenides, I don't know if I can buy into that. I think that everything is in a state of flux, that everything is in a state of change. And the reason I think that is because I can never step into the same stream twice. That stream is moving, it's flowing, so every time I step into it, it's different, it's evolving, it is changing. And that thought, that search for the universals, led us to the introduction of these 4 men that I'd like you to know. Now, let's fast forward to the 1700s, to the age of the Enlightenment, looking for a unifying principle. And there we find a man by the name of David Hume. And David Hume did not have a very good experience, religious experience in his life, so he ended up developing a system which really did away with God once and for all. He said in his treatise on human nature, he said that all knowledge, his unifying principle, all knowledge is based on sense perception. That is, by what we can see and what we can touch and what we can smell and what we can hear, our senses. And since we can't smell or touch or hear or see God, then God doesn't exist. We have no experience of God, so we have no experience that God could possibly exist. In fact, he did away with what we call the teleological argument for the existence of God. The teleological argument, teleos, is the argument from design. For every design, there must be an adequate designer. And the more complicated the design, the more complicated the designer. If you have a jet aircraft that can travel at 650 miles an hour, someone must have designed that. And that person that designed that must have been a very, very intelligent person. In fact, everything that is in the design must exist within the designer. So if we see a very complex world, we would say there must be an adequate designer for the complexity of the world, for the human eye, for the phenomenon of language, for the human fingerprint. But Hume said, no. We can't experience God, so there can't be any God. He was an agnostic. Charles Darwin was a follower of David Hume. Charles Darwin believed in the concept of natural selection. There is no design involved here on the part of any God. Things are simply evolving through a natural selection. And they were compelled to believe that therefore there could be no God, and there was no existence of God. There were no miracles. There was no intervention of God into our world. We were left here alone. We lack the experience of the divine. We can't sense it. We can't know it. And there is no evidence of it. Well, along came a fellow by the name of the second person that I'd like to introduce to you today, a man by the name of Immanuel Kant. Kant is probably the most influential of the Enlightenment thinkers. And Kant ran into Hume and he said, well, Mr. Hume, that's fine that you've done away with God, but we still have to have a universal sense of absolutes or morals or norms in life. And if there is no God, if there's no absolute up there, where do we find that? And Kant said, well, I'll give you this, Mr. Hume. I'll give you that the phenomenological world, the world of particulars that we live in down here, the world of sense experiences that we live in down here, I'll give you that world. And I'll give you that we can't know the noumenal world up there, the world of the spiritual, of the divine, of God himself. I'll give you that. But we still must live as if there is a noumenal world, as if there is a God. Otherwise, we have no absolutes. We have no values, we have no standards, we have no norms. So Kant created a thing he called the categorical imperative, that even though there is no God, we must live as if there is a God, so that we have certain imperatives, certain standards, certain guidelines, certain boundary lines by which all people in all societies can live. We have certain obligations, certain commitments, certain covenants that bind all of the circumstances of life. And so Kant said, you've got to understand, Mr. Hume, we just have to assume this stuff. Well, this is where things get really interesting in this search for the universal. So now we find a man by the name of Friedrich Hegel. Hegel developed what he considered to be a unifying or universal principle to explain all the particulars. And that was what he called his dialectical idealism. Now, I don't want to get into that whole concept. I want to focus on the word dialectic. The word dialectic Hegel got from the Greek Socratic method of debate, where you would have one view and an opposing view, and they would come together, and hopefully they would develop a new reality. A third alternative, you might have heard it this way, that there's a thesis, a antithesis against the thesis, and a synthesis, a new reality, a new way of thinking. Hegel said, in every day and in every way, the world is getting better and better and better. That we, through reason and through logic and through education and science, that we can create a better world for ourselves. And, just as a side note here, because again, Hegel had no room for God whatsoever. He was just concerned about his dialectic, creating better and better and better and better worlds until one day we would reach this ideal world, this utopia. I've often wanted to say to him, and this has to do with who are we? Remember that question, who are we, who is man? Just as a sort of side here, I've often wanted to ask him, Mr. Hegel, did you ever have any children? Because my experience is unlike yours. You believe that we're born basically good, that we were born with a blank slate, a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And then it's our sense experiences that shape and mold and create us. But the God of the Bible says, no, we're born basically fallen. And we'll get into this fallenness when we look at Marx's doctrine of labor and of class struggle. But I just want you to know, Mr. Hegel, if you think that we're born basically a blank slate or a tabula rasa, or basically good, then my kids, when they were born, I have had to spend absolutely no time, none whatsoever, teaching them how to be bad. And I have had to devote myself to teaching them how to be good. I thought that the first words of my firstborn son were going to be "Daddy" and "I love you." I found out his first words were "me," "mine," "no way," and "right now." And I'm the owner of this household here, not you. I came into this world, now I'm the center of the universe. So we have a little problem here with this concept of doing away with God and of doing away with an understanding of the fallenness of human nature with these men. So here we have Hegel. He's got this dialectic idealism going here. He loves this idea of the dialectic, of the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis coming together to create this new reality. And that's when we meet our fourth and final character that I'd like you to become familiar with. So let me introduce you to a man by the name of Karl Marx, who lived in the mid to late 1800s and was possibly one of the great thinkers of that period of time. He fell in love with a concept called dialectical materialism. Now let me explain that to you. He fully understood the search, the quest for a unifying principle of the universals, and in particular a monism understanding of life, that there needed to be a unifying principle. He understood the debate between Parmenides and Heraclitus. He understood David Hume's death of God. He understood Immanuel Kant trying to put together some reason, some categorical imperative, some set of absolutes, because Hume's system left us with nothing. He certainly understood Hegel's dialectic, and he loved the concept of the dialectic, of the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. He loved that concept. So he came up with this idea of dialectical materialism. Now, let me explain this for you. Early on in his life, Karl Marx had a life-changing experience. He grew up as a Jew, and at a particular point in his life, his father, who was a devout Jew, moved to a different city, and for purely economic reasons, to get a better job, and he wanted to pursue a law degree and a practice of law, he converted from Judaism to Lutheranism. And little Karl Marx saw this dramatic change from being a very devout religious Jewish family to his father leaving all of his faith for the sake of wages and money and an income and status in life, for business. And he thought, I don't think I like this religious thing very well. I thought that all of life was explained, the unifying principle was explained by faith in God. But it's not. He said the dialectic, the tension, the debate between the thesis and the antithesis is not about God, it's not about faith, it's not about sense perception, it's not about a categorical imperative, it's not about dialectical idealism that the world's getting better and better every day. The unifying principle of all of life is economics. It's wages, it's work, it's labor. That is why he called it dialectical materialism. It's about material things. It's about money and what money can buy. And that economics, understanding of life from an economic viewpoint, shapes all of history and all events and all of our human lives. And he saw that there was a clash of economic systems going on in his lifetime. The dialectic, the thesis and the antithesis, the tension, the conflict that was created was between the wealthy ownership class and the poor laborers who were marginalized and voiceless. He called that, as you know, the bourgeoisie, the wealthy class, and the proletariat. And they clash together, and the workers are left with absolutely no rights and have nothing. All of the power in the economic system goes to the owners. And if that were not enough, he said, we have come out of this agricultural society where a fair day's work was a fair day's wages. You went out and you mowed the hay down and you brought it back and you fed the cows and they produced milk. And what effort you put into it, you got back out of that. But all of that changed with the Industrial Revolution, with factories, with a production process, with owners and with laborers. And at that moment, the laborers did not get a fair take of what they produced. On a farm, it was fair. But here in the factory, there's an enormous inequality and injustice which is taking place. And so he decided to address that issue. And this is where we get down to this question of what is your truth source in life. So what is your truth source? Well, for Hegel and for Marx, there is no truth source. Truth comes from within. We sense things and we absorb them, and then we come up with our own truth system. There is no external truth source that's good for all people at all times in all ways. And as you know, they denied the teleological argument for the existence of God. They said there is no adequate designer for a design. There is no design. Of course, we know that there must be a designer for a design. And they did away with the cosmological argument. That's the question of origins. Where did everything that is come from in the first place? I remember speaking with a scientist one time, a nuclear scientist, and he said, we figured out there is no need for God, that the universe started as a tiny ball of matter and energy the size of a peanut. All of the universe, everything was collapsed down to this tiny ball of matter and energy the size of a peanut, and that there was this great explosion, this big bang, and it's been expanding ever since then. Here we have planet Earth as a result of that explosion, all of which may be true, but it ignores the question of origins, the cosmological question. It ignores the question it ignores the question of where did the peanut come from? Where did the original matter and energy of the universe come from in the first place? Science asks the question, how does what is function? It doesn't provide an explanation for what is or where it came from. That's the question of origins. Well, they ignored that, and they ignored this question of a universal truth source. Where does truth come from in the first place? They sort of adopted an early Greek principle by the name of Protagoras, who said, man is the measure of all things. It was sort of the Copernican revolution, where God is no longer the center of the universe, but man is, that we are. Atlas shrugged, Ayn Rand, we carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. There is no objective true source other than us and what we think and what we believe and what we feel. And that's a slippery slope. As you know, we live in a world today where many voices are saying to us, if I believe it, it must be true. And if I believe it and if it must be true for me, then it must be true for you as well. And if you don't disagree with me, there comes a point where a person becomes dogmatic, and that dogmatic viewpoint leads to anger, and at times anger of you're not agreeing with me leads to violence when we don't have a common truth source for us. And so we say, okay, it's not just about what I feel or what you feel, but is there an external truth source that is absolute, that is infinite, that views life from an infinite, eternal perspective, rather than our lives, which view life from a finite, limited perspective. Now, I want to talk to you for a moment about the concept of circular reasoning. Circular reasoning says that once I agree to or accept a set of presuppositions, and I step into that circle, then all of life makes sense to me. If I agree with the presuppositions of Muhammad, then Islam makes sense to me. If I agree with the presupposition or principles of Buddhism, then I can understand or view all of life through that lens. Witchcraft, modern day witchcraft in America today. If I accept their certain presuppositions, I step into that. It explains life. It explains good and bad, relationships, education. It gives me an ideology for the world. That's circular reasoning. Now we as Christians don't function on circular reasoning. We could say, well, you just believe our system, and once you step in it, all of life will make sense to you. You'll understand what marriage is about and relationships and how to raise kids and how to be a part of business and how the marketplace works and what church is all about and how to worship. But you have to buy that by faith. Well, I don't really buy that because every system, every circle is saying the same thing. Accept by faith our presuppositions, our unifying principles, and then all of life will make sense to you. But I think Christianity comes from the basis of reason. You see, we call it the debate between Jerusalem and Athens, between faith and reason. And we lean on the reason part. We want to know. We want to look at things. We want to understand things. So we have three presuppositions that all ideologies and all people and all belief systems have to assume. One is self-existence. I think, therefore I am. Descartes. We have to assume I exist. The second one is I have to assume that my sense perceptions are correct. I do agree with Hegel in that concept. What I see is what I see. And the third thing that we have to agree to is what is called the law of non-contradiction. That is, and I know this gets complicated, but it goes like this. A, quote, A, cannot be, quote, A and, quote, non-A at the same time in the same relationship. That is, that a table can't be a table and a chair. It can only be a table. A table, cannot be a table and not a table at the same time. A cannot be A and not A at the same time in the same relationship. A chair can't be a chair and not a chair. A chair can't be a chair and a table at the same time in the same relationship. We assume those three presuppositions. Now, the law of non-contradiction is important because it gives us language. When I say dog, you know that I don't mean elephant. A dog can't be an elephant. It is a dog. That's the law of non-contradiction. So once we start with those three things, we begin to reason or look at the world and see if there is anything out there that makes any sense to us. And the first question we really ask is this question of a truth source in our lives. What is the truth source that we come to in our lives? And this gets us beyond that whole world of dogmatism, or what I call relativism. I was having a discussion with a person one time who said to me, you Christians, you're so dogmatic. You believe that everything is right or wrong or good or bad or light and darkness. You're so dogmatic. You believe in absolutes. And I said, do you realize the statement you just made to me is an absolute statement? Do you realize that the statement, there are no rights and wrongs, is a dogmatic statement? It's a right or wrong statement? That all statements are dogmatic. All statements are absolute in that sense. The statement, there are no absolutes, is an absolute statement. So I'm looking for what's true, not from what I feel or what I think and then become dogmatic or even angry or violent about it, but I'm looking for what's true for all people at all times and in all places. And here we find that God has revealed himself to us. He's revealed himself in general revelation to us. God has revealed to all people that he exists. Paul writes in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, these words, Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them. What can be known? And when he says them, he means all people everywhere. What can be known about God in a general sense in our world is plain to everyone, because God has shown it to them. It's not just that it's out there, but God has taught it. He has revealed it. He has shown it. He has made sure that it gets through to our senses and our perception. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. You see what's been revealed since the beginning of the world? His eternal power, that's a cosmological argument. He created the world, called it into being ex nihilo. His divine nature, there are certain attributes of God, the beauty, the love, the joy, the peace, the goodness of God. It's revealed to us so that no one is without excuse. This is an external truth that is given to us. And if that were not enough, we read later on in Romans, we read this passage that God talks about putting a true source within us. Paul writes these words in Romans chapter 2, verse 14. For when the Gentiles, that is the world, who do not have the law, that is the law of Moses or the Holy Scriptures, by nature do what the law requires, that is what the Holy Scriptures of the law requires, that is to treat people properly and with morals and with value and with absolute grace and justice and equality. When they do that, what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. That is, when you do that, you've created a law that ought to be good and observed for all people, what is common decency and courtesy towards one another, even though they do not have the law. Now, here's what's important in Romans 2, chapter 15. He writes, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. That is, he's saying that when we're born, we're not born tabula rasa, like these Enlightenment thinkers claim, but we're born with a conscience. We know inside what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, what's light and dark. We know that inherently being born into the human race, into humanity, that God created us that way, and that all men know that. Now, certainly people create terrible atrocities, and there's all these anomalies, but at the core of things, we know intrinsically what is right and wrong. This is what we call general revelation. So we know in the world about us, and we know inside of us, in our own hearts, that there is a God who's created us with certain values. Now, you can compare that with Kant, and you can compare that with Hegel and with Hume, who deserted these principles, and certainly Karl Marx. And you're going to see the tremendous implications of that as we move on in this series. But not only is there a God who's revealed himself externally and internally in our world and in our lives, but he's spoken verbally to us, through words to us. He's told us who he is, who we are, who Jesus is. He's communicated. He's revealed himself to us. He tells us what we need to know about how to live our lives, from our understanding of spirituality and our own emotions and our psychological attitudes and responses, to how to raise families, to how to be a good and proper and fair individual, and most importantly of our need, because of our fallenness and our brokenness, our need of some kind of reconciliation or atonement before God, so that we can be restored back into a relationship with him. And that this revelation, this Holy Scripture, is external, it is verifiable, it stands outside of us, and it is good for all people at all times. And so let me end this message by asking you a question. What is your truth source? And how do you know that it's true? Just take some moments to talk about that if you're with a group of people, or if you're alone, to journal that a little bit. What is your truth source, and how do you know it's true? Now, in this next message, I want to really dive into the implications of neo-Marxism or modern-day socialism on your life and on mine.